James O'Brien on LBC.
4 minutes after 11. What do you think of violent drug addicts? Just straight up, off the top of your head. There's a violent drug addict over there committing a crime. What do you think of them? Yeah, exactly. It's too good for him, isn't it? Yeah. This is one of the more troubling stories that we'll ever discuss together, and I'm not quite sure, actually, which angle to approach it. If you'd been abused as a child, because that's my next question, once you've told me what you think about violent drug addicts, tell me what you think about victims of child sexual abuse. See, it's almost the opposite in binary terms. You have undiluted sympathy for victims of child sexual abuse and almost undiluted antipathy towards violent criminals, leaving the addiction aside, perhaps, for the time being. What if it's the same person? What if the violent criminal is the victim of child sexual abuse? Now what do you think of them? What if substance abuse is involved in the criminality? Arguably, you could never prove it, but I think most of us possessed of a functioning conscience would accept that if you were trying to shut out horrible memories from your own childhood, then alcohol and drugs would help, at least in the short term. What if you genuinely believe that your childhood, that the child is the father of the man or the mother of the woman, that your childhood traumas do actually, in part or indeed entirely, explain your adult failures, your adult disasters, your adult crimes? I actually didn't believe my ears when I heard this on the radio earlier today, so the first thing I did when I got into work was double check. It's a Freedom of Information inquiry submitted to the Criminal Injuries Compensation Authority. Remember, the government are trying to get rid of the Freedom of Information Act. And as a result of the inquiry, they have discovered more than 400 sex abuse victims in Britain who had their compensation reduced or removed because they later committed criminal offences. Drink, drug and violence-related crimes. The case study that they use is a powerful one. It's a girl who was 15 years old when she was groomed and abused for more than 4 years before she ran away from her South Yorkshire home, after she ran away from her South Yorkshire home at the age of 15. A lead witness at her abuser's trial, she applied for compensation and was turned down because she has unspent convictions for theft and assault. And she says that these offences took place before the trial even took place, and during a period of her life when she says she was addicted to so-called legal highs. She's now cleaned herself up, got married, and is pregnant with her first child. So the £15,000 or so she might have expected from the compensation board could have made a huge difference both to her life and to the life of her imminent bambino.
When Jane, not her real name, was 15, she ran away from home. She was sheltered by someone she thought was a friend, who groomed her and sexually exploited her for more than 4 years, making her have sex with men she didn't know. Odette Tovey is her solicitor.
This girl was subjected to repeated child exploitation involving carrying out sexual acts with unknown men, locked in rooms. She was encouraged to take drugs, which led to her being dependent, likewise with the alcohol. Eventually, Jane went to the police. Her abusers were found guilty and jailed. But when Jane applied for compensation from the Criminal Injuries Compensation Authority, she was turned down. In the run-up to the trial, she'd been found guilty of assault and theft, offences prompted, she says, by her addictions and mental health problems linked to the abuse. Jane was disappointed. Since the trial, she's given up drugs, she's got married, she's expecting her first child. The compensation would have helped her start a new life away from her abusers. Her words are spoken by an actor.
I would like to move away in the future, so I never have to see them men in the street. If I do get the compensation, it'll change mine and my baby's life forever. I'm going to open a shop, so my baby's got a better future.
She's learned that other witnesses in the case did get compensation.
I've been told by a couple of people that they received about £15,000. That makes me really angry, because while the main witnesses haven't received anything, the others have. It's probably because they ain't got a criminal record.
I think it's wrong. I think the Criminal Injuries Compensation Authority need to change the way in which they assess these particular victims. Although I agree with their principle that somebody who's committed crimes should not benefit when they've been a victim themselves. These are not just normal criminals. These are people who have been through the most atrocious acts committed against them. It's affected their mental health. And some of the crimes that they've committed are not as bad as the ones committed against them.
We made a request under Freedom of Information, or FOI, to the Criminal Injuries Compensation Authority. We asked how many victims of child sex abuse had, like Jane, had applications turned down. They said they didn't keep that information. So we asked how many had their compensation reduced and why. They told us since the start of 2010, 438 people who'd been sexually abused as children or as vulnerable adults had been given reduced compensation because of their own criminal convictions. So then we asked what those criminal convictions were. They said they couldn't tell us. It would take more time than FOI rules permit. So we asked for a sample between June last year and June this year. That turned out to be a small group, just 27 people, and while some were guilty of violent offences, more were guilty of drink or drugs offences, theft or property crimes. Peter Saunders is the spokesman for the National Association for People Abused in Childhood.
It's patently obvious in most cases that where somebody has gone down a route of criminality preceded by a life totally devastated by abuse, that there is a link, and for the system to fail to recognise that is for the system to be failing our people. Absolutely should review it, and we as a charity have been banging on the door of the Ministry of Justice for a long time to educate and to inform them about the consequences of these crimes and how they are very different from many other areas of criminality, both as victims and as sometimes as the offenders that the victims subsequently become.
The Criminal Injuries Compensation Authority told us they have to follow strict rules. We asked the Ministry of Justice whether they had any plans to review these rules. They said no and gave us a statement.
Under the scheme, an applicant may be refused or awarded a reduced payment if they have an unspent conviction. This reflects the fact they may have caused distress, loss or injury to another person and cost the taxpayer money through a police investigation or court proceedings.
Jane is appealing against the decision and says even a small amount would help. According to our FOI inquiry, the average award after reduction was nearly £8,500.
And yet, you know, I mean, you can ask any question you want, can't you, during these times that we spend together. I mean, part of me would ask if this wasn't a subject matter that leaves me reeling with shock and disgust at the national attitude at the moment. I would almost ask whether or not compensation is appropriate. Why would writing a cheque seem an appropriate social response to the appalling abuses that women like Jane have suffered? But that's a conversation for a different day. You get compensation if you've been a victim of crime. You get compensation if you've been a victim of child abuse. I can only imagine what it would have been like to be raped as a child. And when I do imagine that, I'm fairly confident I would not be the adult I am now. Does that strike you as a risky relationship between that fictional child and this actual adult? I'm pretty sure that I would have run at 100 miles an hour away from what had happened to me, and one of the fastest ways to run would have been to get high, or to get loaded, or to get plastered on a regular basis. The more agony and pain I was nursing within, the more anaesthetic, whether legal or illegal, I'd be seeking without. And as a result of that lifestyle, the environment it brought me into, and the attendant poverty it would almost certainly spawn, can I imagine myself becoming a criminal, a mugger, a drug dealer? Not quite. But it's easier to imagine them being raped as a little boy. So yeah, I can. If subsequently we bring my abuser to justice, and ordinarily this conviction would entitle me to a cheque from the Criminal Compensation Board, should the fact that I have convictions for dealing drugs, for drunken disorderly, for violent misdemeanours, see a reduction in my compensation? The logical answer, if you leave all emotion, feeling and thought out of this, is that the crimes I've committed cost society money, and this offers me an opportunity to pay some of it back. But I guess there are two elements to this conversation. Should criminals seeking compensation for abuse suffered as children be treated differently from people who haven't been convicted of any crimes? Here are the numbers now, you will get through. And I know it will be tough for you, but do you think that things that happened to you as a child do explain why you got into so much bother as a grown-up? Because that seems to me to be the most straightforward of pathways, the most easy to understand. And yet those two questions I ask you at the outset: what do you think about violent criminals? What do you think about violent druggies? And what do you think about victims of child sex abuse? Give two completely different answers, and then boom. What if it's the same person? What cancels what out? What dilutes? Does the sympathy for the victim of child abuse dilute the distaste for the perpetrator of violent crimes? Or does the distaste for the perpetrator of violent crimes somehow overshadow the sympathy for the victim of child sex abuse? Can they cancel each other out completely? Because if they cancel each other out completely, then the criminal, former victim, deserves to be treated identically to the non-criminal victim. I want your thoughts, but I also want your stories on this. 0345 6060973 is the number to call. So I don't subscribe to the hang 'em and flog 'em brigade. I have a lot of fun doing battle with people who do. And yet I do understand the impulse. I mean, you want to keep it as far away from you as possible, this sort of behaviour. But I also believe that, with a few fairly grim exceptions, the massive majority of us have really been woken up by revelations regarding child sex abuse recently. And the knowledge that victims can often receive some sort of financial help in order to get their lives back on even keels, or just to recognise the failure of society to protect them. Think about all the girls who've suffered in the north of England with the Asian grooming gangs up there, and then sort of imagine, because the details of this case study seem to suggest she may have been one of their victims. She ran away at 15. She was groomed and abused for more than 4 years, forced to have sex with men she didn't know after being made dependent upon drugs and alcohol. Subsequently broke laws, got convicted. Abuser comes to trial. Other witnesses at that trial have received compensation. She hasn't, because of her unspent convictions. I think that's wrong. What do you think? 0345 6060973 is the number to call, because I suppose what I'm really nudging you towards is the notion that certain types of crimes are committed by certain types of people, and those people very, very often are nursing epic childhood trauma. And yet, run it through the ringer of a newspaper column and it could end up being bleeding heart liberalism, suggesting, oh yeah, I suffered in your childhood, so that's why you beat up that little old lady and stole her pension book. Oh yeah, spare me the violins, pour me a drink. And yet we're probably talking about victims of child abuse. I guess the more horrible your past, the more determined you'll be to run away from it. Nigel's in Wimbledon. Nigel, what made you pick up the phone?
To talk about this, James, actually. Hello.
Hello.
I'm a survivor of child sexual abuse.
Yes.
I don't have a criminal record, but I do work on a voluntary basis in a number of charities at the moment that assist survivors and so on. I think what's really important in this, and I agree with you about what you said, is that just the end of your last observation, is that there is a lack of understanding in this country about the impact that abuse has on people, and it's not necessarily just abuse, but it is also mental health issues. And who knows? Who's done a study yet of how many people who are incarcerated in our prisons have mental health problems? And this is not a debate about criminology or that kind of thing.
Sure.
But the fact is that people will be affected.
How can you not be? It is remarkable that we don't have a deeper understanding or a deeper empathy, actually.
Well, indeed, I agree. But I think what is beginning to happen, and one can, this again is a slightly different conversation,
Sure.
but people talk about, the value, the merits or not of the overarching inquiry into sexual abuse and so on. But it is starting, and you are helping with, I believe, a national debate about what is the impact of this. And we, as a nation, as a society, I believe, need to recognise the important needs of people who have been abused in the past, but actually work for a social shift towards stopping it in the future. And education really, is the only way, because you can't. Yesterday's story, wasn't it? It was about how Sarah's law's failing. But the child abuse, it's the best abusers in the world are the ones that have never been caught.
Of course they are, and you're right that the light is now being shone into dark corners where it hasn't shone previously. Late is of course better than never. But I suppose, and this is going to make me sound a bit academic, as if I'm, but it is, I think, logical to suggest that if the abuse is in some way offered up as the reason for the criminality, which most people listening will find perfectly plausible, then what's to stop the next stage in this process being mitigation in court? So you can say, yes, I did hit her over the head, I did steal a pension book, but I was abused as a child, so don't convict me or don't send me to jail. Do you see what I mean? I know that sounds a little callous, but it's, I think, intellectually sound.
Yeah, well, absolutely. It's an extremely difficult area. I mean, if I had answers to it, I would have written a book.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's what we do, I guess. We sort of just grope around in the darkness, hoping to find some sort of clarity and illumination. That's a great start. Thank you, Nigel. I've got phone lines free on this. It won't be an hour. Well, you never know, actually. Some of the hours we've dedicated to this issue. I made a promise, if you're new to the programme, a couple of years ago when the first whispers started about high-level child sex abuse, that we would carry on talking about it until they dragged me out of the studio kicking. They haven't done that yet, and we haven't stopped. And sometimes when we're doing it, there's almost a sort of group therapy feel to proceedings, and my phones ring off the hook. Other times, it's a lot more difficult to bring people forward, and I never know which way a particular angle will go. This is a very new angle, a question of actual financial compensation. 438 people have had their government-funded compensation reduced because they had committed criminal offences themselves. Is that fair? 0345 6060 973. And if you want to distill this whole issue down into one simple question, this is the question you need. What if that violent criminal you despise is also a child sex abuse survivor to whom you feel nothing but warmth and sympathy? Tough conversation, but if you don't want to have it, then you are part of the problem. The child sex abuse scandal sweeping the country at the moment, and I have to tell you that it is not going away. Some of the names now being investigated are both household and alive, so we'll be keeping up to speed with all of that. It's against that backdrop, however, that news today of 438 people having their government-funded compensation reduced because they had committed criminal offences themselves, that sticks in the craw. 27 cases where compensation was reduced just between June of this year, between last month and last year. Half were for drugs, theft or property offences. 8 involved violence. The authority won't say how many applications by such victims has been rejected, but we know it's a thing, as it were. We know that is why. Should it be? Should anybody get compensation having been a victim of crime? Martin's in Dulwich. Martin, what would you like to say?
Hello, James. What it is, I was a victim of sexual abuse as a child from about the age of 9, from my mother, my father, and then later on my brother.
Oh, Lord.
It's kind of what happened was when it first happened, I finally realised what was happening. Around about the age of 13, I used to skip school quite a bit because of all the trouble that was going on at home. I ended up going to social services on my own. I used to Sky School. I used to go to the library instead of kind of knocking about and feeding and doing what people do when they're training or whatever. Yeah. So I used to sit in the library and read. It got to the point where the education welfare officer got involved and said, "Look, what's wrong?" And I said, "Look, I can't go to school. I can't cope." I then went down to social services and tried to speak to them about it. They took me in. Didn't really think anything of it. I explained my whole story. They ended up calling. They spent the day with me, interviewing me, and they handed me back to my parents at the end of the day because they thought I was lying, and I had then got beaten senseless because of it. You don't really you don't really understand what's happening at the time. You try because they're your parents,
and it's all you know. I suppose it's because you don't know any different when you're young. That's how they get away with it.
Well, the thing is, you don't realise it's wrong until a certain age, until you start learning about sex and other bits and pieces. I'm by no means have you finished talking. I just want to just for the benefit of other people listening who I just want to just remind them of what you just said there. You don't know that what's happening to you is wrong until you start learning about sex. Now, this isn't why you've rung in, and this is me banging one of my own drums, and I apologise for that, but I can't let the opportunity pass. That is why any adult who argues against this sort of education being compulsory in primary schools is downright dangerous. You just heard Martin there, victim of a horrible childhood. You don't know what is happening is wrong until somebody teaches you that it is, or until you start learning about matters sexual. So when you hear somebody saying, "I don't want sex education in primary schools," they are creating the environments in which little boys like Martin can be abused. That's just a point that I felt had to be made. You carry on, Martin. I'm sorry to interrupt you. The onus was kind of left onto the parents to teach them how to do it. But unfortunately, both my parents used a lot of drugs at the time. They still do. This kind of led me. My father gave me my first line of cocaine at the age of 14. Yeah, he used to do illegal raves, and he used to get me sitting in the corner at the age of 14 selling beer all night for him. Yeah, it's not good.
So where are you now in life, and how much of your adulthood do you think was affected by your childhood?
Completely. It's completely affected me. I got into so much trouble. I got into a lot of trouble, but the police never caught me for it. I have a daughter who's now nearly 16. It's affected how I view her as my daughter. Yeah. Because I'm frightened because they keep saying that if you've been a victim of sexual abuse, you will then do it yourself. No, that's not the case at all. I've done everything I can to try and give my daughter the best life, even if it's removed me from her life for a short period of time, because of the stuff that's been going on in my life. Now, I can't blame anybody else for the way my life is now, other than me. I mean, my life is good now. It hasn't always been. I still battle with drugs. I have a drugs counsellor, but I keep it under control. I have a wife now. I also have my own company. So it's life is good, but it was only through the support of my wife, or my girlfriend, now wife, yes, who helped me through it.
And when you heard me describing this morning how other adults who've suffered similar experiences to what you suffered as a child, and who haven't been able to necessarily drag themselves out of that environment or those behaviours as effectively as you have, being entitled when their abusers are convicted to some form of compensation, the notion that some of that compensation gets surrendered if you've ended up being convicted yourself, it has a callous logic to it, doesn't it? How does it reach your ears?
I mean, for me personally, I don't want any kind of compensation. I mean, the people that did what they did to me are still walking about free, and it's...
You never thought about going to the authorities?
I mean, I spoke to my mum up until maybe a year ago, properly, just to try and have some kind of relationship. The last time my father tried it on me was when I was 21. My brother, he was about 25. I was about maybe 4 years ago when he tried it on. But it was down to drink and drugs, and obviously what's underlying in their own personalities.
Yeah.
See, it's so important. I'm so glad you're listening and confident enough to have these conversations. 5 years ago, we wouldn't have done this. People were not feeling empowered enough. You might have done, Martin, I don't mean to. But the scale of people now comfortable talking, and of course, talking to people, talking to friends, talking to family, talking on the radio, which can sometimes be more cathartic, actually, than confiding in just one individual, because it's both more anonymous and yet more public at the same time. But most importantly of all, of course, talking to the authorities, although not everybody wants to, not everybody can. How about the compensation? I don't think, albeit that your tweets are always brilliant, I don't think we can pin this on the Tories, can we? Incorrigible FCA? I really don't, because presumably this situation has been in place for a while. To take money away from victims of the most horrible of crimes in order to ramp up the financial system when they're taking away legal aid, I don't know. You can tell. I'm a bit thrown by Martin's call, actually. I do find these conversations so important but so difficult, and I know you do as well. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need if you want to join in. It's a simple enough statement, because I'm getting a few texts and emails. I never know. The problem with electronic communications is you never know, especially if they're under anonymous names, how serious people are being. There's some suggestion that you shouldn't get any money at all simply for being the victim of a crime, and that while this feels wrong, it's wrong against the backdrop of a bigger wrong, which is the notion of a financial compensation for a crime. But I can't quite get my head around how you could allow your mind to go down that road. What should we be doing to these people who've been victims of crime? I know, making their life worse than it currently is. Because at the moment they get some money, and it would be better if they didn't. I just think that makes you a bit horrible, doesn't it? Unless I'm missing something. Getting money as compensation for being a victim of crime is not a black and white issue, but it is what happens in this country. Unless you've got unspent convictions, in which case the money you're entitled to will be reduced or removed, even if the crime you are a victim of was child sex abuse. So even if you were a victim of child sex abuse as a child, then as an adult you become a criminal, and then after that, after those convictions are secured, you actually manage to get your abuser jailed, you lose out. How can that even happen? Mike's in Palmer's Green. Mike, what would you like to say?
Can I mention 2 points that you made, please?
Yes, of course, Mike.
Is that I don't really disagree with taking away someone's compensation for having suffered, because there's a space of time between having suffered and receiving the compensation, or the decision made to give you compensation. And if you commit a crime between then and then,
yes, then
why should it be reduced? Because if, let's say, for example, the level of care that person got was substandard, then do they then have a look at it and say, okay, you get more compensation then? Because...
Shall I tell you what the Ministry of Justice says?
Yes.
They answer your question directly. They say that the refusal or reduction of an awarded payment reflected the fact that that individual, and now I'm quoting, may have caused distress, loss or injury to another person and cost the taxpayer money through a police investigation or court proceedings, which is, in strictly factual terms, Mike, true.
Yeah. That kind of brings me to the second point, when you asked whether or not your upbringing contributes to how you conduct yourself as an adult. And I think it, not necessarily for bad, but yes, it does either way. Of course it does. And I've never suffered any sexual abuse like your last caller, or many other people, but I know I've been, as a child, been through quite a bad time with physical abuse, like being beaten up by bullies. My mum was really not very nice. It's affected me hugely, really, as an adult, and it's caused me to make lots of mistakes. I'm serving a suspended sentence at the moment, which I've discussed with you before. Yeah. And yeah, it totally does. So,
thing is, you know, and I know, if we were coming at this from a slightly different angle, we can both imagine a voice saying, well, I know plenty of people who had unpleasant mums and had violent childhoods, and they didn't end up serving suspended sentences. What makes you so special? Do you see what I mean? I don't know how you ever prove...
I'm not saying I'm special.
No, I know you're not, but I'm being that voice, mate. I'm not being sensible. I'm being that voice encouraging people to hate and get angry and be cross and to turn on each other. Grrr, what's so special about you? Why should you get special treatment? Everyone's had a tough childhood. Does everyone with a tough childhood have the right to go out and mug little old ladies?
I have a very, very, very good friend suffered horrific sexual abuse when he was a child, and he's one of the most outstanding adults I've ever met in my life. He's like a role model to me, he always has been. And then, I've suffered much less than him, and I've become a much worse adult than he has.
So that's the point, isn't it? It's not a clear graph. It's not a neatly plotted graph between childhood horror and adult criminality. And yet, I don't think many people listening would struggle to see that there must be a link between the two.
Yeah, I mean, can you have any compassion for someone, like you say, is a criminal, and you think, oh, that's a really horrible person, but then you realise that they're the victim of sexual abuse as a child? Now, I've totally all the compassion in the world for people, no matter how horrible they are now, for what they've been through, because it's clear that they've suffered so much. Maybe they haven't got an outlet, someone to talk to.
Yeah. I mean, it's a way of giving back some time, in a way. Money buys time. And if you've had your childhood stolen, as in cases some of the people we've spoken to, by your own parents, it doesn't seem to me to be too outrageous to suggest that money helps make up for that. Not just the lost innocence, but the lost time as well. And yet, this is what the Ministry of Justice say. That people like Mike may have caused distress, loss or injury to another person and cost the taxpayer money through a police investigation or court proceedings. And that's just true. The question thus becomes, does the fact that victim of child sex abuse over there went on to commit crimes as an adult that cost society money mean that the money society will give to them for being a victim gets reduced or taken away? I've got a horrible feeling that the more cool the logic, the more dispassionate the description of the facts, the more sense this begins to make, although it still makes me want to hurl. Layla is in Penge. Layla, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Hi. I spoke to you about this time last year, actually, and I just...
it's our anniversary, is it, Layla? It's our anniversary call. Fantastic.
Yeah. I just want to say that it's a really interesting conversation, because I wasn't sexually abused or physically abused as a child. I had quite a loving, it wasn't a perfect upbringing, but
sure.
it was loving. But I spent 23 years on heroin and crack. And I'm 19 months off of it now, and my life's going in a great, brilliant direction. Well done. But in that time, I've been in prison 4 times. I've been in and out of detox rehabs and that. I've spent, as a friend said to me recently, he said he was on heroin for 6 years, and it took him 7 years to get off it, because that's what it's like. You know what I mean?
Yes.
In all that time I've met, it's just shocking. Basically, most people that I've met, and I've met a lot from being in detox, and we used to do groups, and you know what I mean, you get close to people, have had some sexual, physical abuse, and it's horrific.
So most, you would say most people, would you, that end up in the kind of...
Okay, so I say most people a lot. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Quite a lot. You know what I mean? And it's kind of I think, wow, I listen to their story and I think, bloody hell, why is it taking me this long? Why am I... I was just purely curious and liked it, and it's just very, very addictive. It took me so long to get off of it. But, anything I did, I went to prison, it was shoplifting, because when you've got a habit, you really need that, you know what I mean? It's the only thing you think of, do you know what I mean?
Yes.
But I could never personally ever have hurt somebody.
Well, theft is one of the offences. Theft or property offences is one of the... I mean, drink and drugs don't involve violence either. I mean, these are the non-violent. Of the 27 cases reduced last year, only 8 involved violence. The rest were drink, drugs, theft or property offences.
Right.
It's just not right, this, is it? It's just wrong.
Yeah, it's wrong. It's wrong. I'm kind of coming from the thing of the empathy for the person that's done the crime. Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
Just because I've seen what people have heard, what people have gone through.
Well, it's almost, Layla. It's almost as if.
Then again, the person,
It's almost as if you've managed to hold it together. I'm here. I think we were interrupting each other, and then we were pausing and waiting for each other. But it's almost as if you've had I know you didn't, but you've had an absolutely miserable childhood, but you've managed to hold it together as an adult, so you get more money than the people who didn't. But James, holding it together is not the opposite of committing crimes. No, it isn't. You're right. But I can't help thinking, I can't help thinking that most of us would probably have been closer to criminality had we had the sort of childhood that some of my correspondents and callers are suggesting. Joe's in Newcastle. Joe, what would you like to say?
Hi, how are you doing? I think, firstly, I kind of agree with you in the sense that I don't understand why we give money to victims of crime. I think it could be better spent on counselling and trying to improve their lives if they've been victims of something terrible. Hang
on. I've asked that question, but I came down on the other side in my own answer with that line about it providing you with compensation for lost time. Money buys you time. It buys you stuff. It buys you comfort, and that's society's way of saying you deserve to be comforted. You deserve time, and you're right. Counselling and the rest would also do that, but it doesn't have to be an either or.
Well, I mean, another point is, I'm a serving police officer, and I'm aware of a very recent case in our area where a lady who's in her early 20s now has made a complaint against a family member who was sexually abused her as a child throughout her whole childhood. Horrendous case. She was brave enough to go to the police with it. She had the courage to go to court with it and give evidence in front of the perpetrator. And this person was rightly found guilty and got 20 years in jail for this crime.
Yes.
Now, this female, at the time she made the complaint, I mean, she had a really dysfunctional life growing up. Prior to this complaint, and even nowadays, her and her horrible boyfriend are very much people who commit low-level crime constantly, lots of antisocial behaviour, lots of low-level theft. They're constantly coming into the eyes of the police, the attention of the police. Now, she was caught. She's a substance abuser now. She's a heroin addict. She smokes the legal high. She's always drinking alcohol. At court, she was awarded £17,000 in compensation. Yeah. Now, I have no problem with that for the crime that she was the victim of.
I can see where you're going.
However, I would like to see something put in place where a panel is, looking at this compensation and saying, actually, this girl is just not in a position in her life now to be given £17,000 without it causing her more harm than good.
No, you're right. But shouldn't the court have taken that into account, or does it not work like that? Should the court not
work like that?
Does it really not?
It's a black and white case. She's awarded the money. It's in your bank account. In a few weeks' time, once it's been agreed. And needless to say, in this particular case, she was awarded the compensation in April, I think, and it's all gone now.
Oh man!
And none of it's been spent on anything purposeful. It's all gone on alcohol, drugs. They just partied for the last couple of couple of months.
Yeah,
I don't have a problem with her getting that money. I don't think people who've been the victims of child sex abuse, regardless of what's happened to them, because to be honest, in fact, it's an astonishing amount of young people that I deal with who are regular offenders. A lot of them have suffered child sex abuse when they were growing up, or come from physically abusive backgrounds.
See, to hear a police officer say that in such sort of cool terms is hardly surprising, and yet it does seem to be absent from most of our analysis of criminality and prisons and the whole rhetoric of hang 'em and flog 'em. Most of certain types of criminals, I wouldn't be surprised if the massive majority of them had at best traumatic and at worst abusive childhoods.
Well, I used to take the opinion that you take responsibility for your own life. Your life is what you make it. But the longer you sit down with these people, some of the younger lads and girls, and you talk to them, at length, and you realise that they got abused when they were very young. The parents they made a complaint. One of their parents didn't believe them. They got put into care, passed from care home to care home to care home. No one's ever been a positive influence in their lives. The only friends that they ever knew were people from similar backgrounds. That lives has just turned into a car crash, and it's no fault of their own at all. It's just, it's really tragic that it's happened. And
that, I'm glad to hear that. I mean, this is another sort of silver lining to the horrible cloud of these conversations, is that we do actually start recognising that these childhoods, corrupted childhoods, have consequences in adulthood. I was abused by my father, says this text, which again, I know this is a bit of a hobby horse of mine, but I make no apology for that, because I think it really needs to be stressed again and again and again. I was abused by my father and didn't know that it was wrong until my science teacher started teaching us about the biological side of sex when I was 9 years old. I said it before and I'll say it again. If you hear an adult telling you that young children shouldn't be taught about sex education, they are personally ensuring, whether intentionally or not, that another generation of children will suffer, not just from the abuse of adults, but also from the ignorance that adults like that need and celebrate to commit their foul crimes. Next time you hear someone on the radio, read someone in the newspaper, see someone on the telly saying, it's outrageous that we're giving sex education to primary school children, just hear in the back of your voice, in the back of your head, this: I think it's magnificent that adults can use complete ignorance of children in order to abuse them, because that, whether they realise it or not, is what they're saying. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. The Ministry of Justice has said that the refusal or reduction of an awarded payment reflected the fact that the individual may have caused distress, loss or injury to another person and cost the taxpayer money through a police investigation or court proceedings. That is why, if you're a victim of child sex abuse and you end up committing crimes as an adult, you'll get less or no compensation. And we are supposed to be seeing the country move towards a greater understanding and condemnation of these sort of crimes. This looks to me like a step backwards, but that doesn't necessarily, of course, mean that it is. 0345 606 0973 is the number to call. Now, I need you to trust me on this, because ordinarily, when we've had a tough hour like this one, I try to give you something a little jollier in the next hour. And when I tell you what we're talking about in the next hour, you're going to think, flip it out, mate. It's Friday. But this is actually an upbeat. It's a conversation we've had in the past, and it's just one of those strangely uplifting conversations. A bit like, have you seen Inside Out yet? You know, when they realise that sadness and joy have to go together all the time? It's a great film. If you haven't taken the kids to see it, if you want to borrow any kids just to have an excuse to go, you should. It's a superb film. Absolutely superb film. But at the beginning, sadness is the alternative to joy. It's like binary, one or the other. Sad stuff can be happy stuff. So when we turn our attention next to deathbed conversations, we could, and I never want to second guess or count my chickens, but we could be in for some pretty powerful tales. And if you've got one, I need to hear it. So I'd give you a heads up now that we'll be doing that in about 10 minutes' time. Back, though, to this question of compensation denied for crimes committed by victims of childhood abuse. Sue is in Dorset. Hello again, Sue.
Hello. Hello, James.
What would you like to say?
Yeah, I had an idea about the whole area of compensation. I just wanted to say thank you very much, James, for raising the issue of child abuse and giving survivors and the topic a good airing. And thank you for that.
Yeah.
My idea is, if you do a crime, you have to do the time. I totally agree with that. I wondered if the compensation, the insurance companies could review the way they dish out or don't dish out the compensation, the money, to survivors who commit a crime by the mitigating circumstances of the abuse, and put it in specific specialist counselling, support and help for them, because that costs loads and loads of money.
But there's no, I mean, these unspent convictions could have been moved on from. There's no guarantee or reason to suspect that people who've committed crimes as a result, or in their adult lives, are in more or less need of counselling and support than people who were abused as children but haven't gone on to be convicted of crimes.
Okay.
Do you see what I mean? I understand what you're doing. It's not insurance companies, it's the criminal injuries compensation scheme that makes these decisions. But I like the suggestion that here is £10,000 and I can't give it to you because you've committed a crime, so I'm going to give it to that therapist over there instead who can treat you and help you. But when you look at what the Ministry of Justice offer up as a reason for not paying the money out at all, it is this: you have cost the taxpayer money through a police investigation or court proceedings, therefore we're taking some of the money that the court is giving to you. I think you're being too open-minded and visionary for our Victorian justice system, Sue.
Oh,
it's worth a try, the notion of mitigation. You mentioned, of course, if you've done a crime, you must do the time. Do you, and I know that you have, I mean, you went through some horrible things yourself. You've called me before as a child, as a little girl. Do you accept that a significant number of adult criminals possibly wouldn't be adult criminals if they hadn't endured abuse such as you endured as children.
Yes, I would speak for many, many, many survivors who have got caught up in drug addiction and then crime, just that alone, to fund that. And I mean, I was abused from the age of 4, and you talked about not knowing as a child what it was. I had no idea what it was. And as I grew up, it became a learnt behaviour, and I actually went into the oldest profession when I was in my sort of 18 upwards.
And if you hadn't been abused as a little girl, that just wouldn't have happened?
No, because I knew how to get money, I'd learnt how to do it, and it was sort of love was involved with the abuse as a child, and so that was the way I got the kind of comfort or a way of control, I don't know. But I'm mixed with people that, were on the drugs, the alcohol. I did a bit of that myself, the alcohol, but if I'd have stayed in it, if I wasn't rescued, I would be like them. So yes, and I'm very fortunate. I feel quite guilty. I'm very fortunate that I've managed to have support to make good choices.
There you go. That's a lovely phrase. You had support to make good choices. Do you know, I thought this would be one subject where my UKIP troll stayed quiet, but here's someone called Luke Morris saying, if James O'Moron is the definition of a parent, the children would be better off being taught by a paedophile. So you've listened to 57 minutes of this, mate, and still all you've got is bile. God. Bill's in Lewisham. Bill, what would you like to say?
Hello, James. How are you?
Bill Maloney.
Yeah, good to talk to you, James.
From Pie and Mash Films. Always good to hear your voice, Bill. What's on your mind? I'm very short of time, mate. I hope we've got enough.
Well, first of all, you are getting quite a big audience for us victims and survivors, and we appreciate what you're doing 100%.
Wow.
But today we have a celebration, and that is the fact that Mr. Ben Fellows is now a free man. He was cleared of
perverting the course of justice after making allegations against the former Home Secretary Ken Clarke. You're quite right, and we have covered it in the news. But in terms of the conversation that we're having today about the compensation, where do you stand on that?
Well, God bless Ben for that anyway.
Fair play.
Hello, all the victims and survivors. Now, as far as the compensation is concerned, at the beginning of last year, I had a firm of solicitors phone me up from up north, and they said they would like to meet me. So I met them in Greenwich, 2 of them. They said to me that they can now take 25% of the victims, whatever they win in court. But their company, their firm, was not going to do it. Therefore, could I put my profile on their site and
encourage people to come forward?
Advertise them.
Well, I mean, solicitors do need paying, but I know what you mean. This looks like they're sort of touting for trade among some of the most vulnerable and damaged people in society. Well, watch this space. I warned you we were short of time, Bill, and we're out of it now. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I want to tell you what's coming up in the next... check out Bill on YouTube if you want to find out a little bit more about the work he does. You'll understand that he's just the most fraught of territories, the most fraught of subject matters, but that's a man whose passion and understanding of the issue is second to none.